I started out just taking piano lessons as a kid, and then I got into jazz when I was around 13. I, for several different reasons, I got into it. My high school had a big band. It was one of the few bands, a few schools around Chicago. That's where I grew up, that had a big band. So I was playing piano in the what they called it was the dance, they used to call it a dance band, a stage band. They couldn't call it a jazz band. So and I started to write arrangements actually in my second year in high school. Um, and I did it because it was interesting to do, and I thought it was, when you heard your arrangement played, it was a lot of fun. It was great. Wow, some of it didn't sound so good, but some of it did. But I really had no idea that I would be a professional arranger, composer. So, although, and when I got into the University of Illinois, I was a composition major, but not in jazz, just a classical comp major. So I studied a lot of different things. I studied African music and Balinese music and Persian classical music, and also, of course, classical theory and fugue and counterpoint. And when I and I kept writing for the big band there, but when I came to New York, it was really to be a jazz piano player. I wanted to build a career as a pianist. So the thing where I started to really write a lot for big bands didn't really happen until I had been in New York. I came to New York in '75, and it was around '82 or '83 I really started to write for Mel Lewis's band. And then I started to do a lot. The two that I always say first are Thad Jones and Bob Brookmeyer. Um, Thad because when I was young, when I was I forget, I think a senior in high school, that's when I first heard Thad Jones, Mel Lewis on the radio, and it knocked me out. I always loved big bands, and but I thought even in those days, the Basie band or the Ellington band, a lot of the solos were more out of the swing era or maybe a bebop some. And I turned on the radio in I was in Chicago. I turned on the radio after school one day, a jazz show, and I heard this very modern quartet playing. I thought, oh wow, I wonder who this is. And all of a sudden, bam, a big band came in. I thought, wow, man, who's that? And at the end, the disc jockey came on. His name was Daddy O'Daly. He was a famous jazz disc jockey in Chicago. He said that was the Thad Jones Mel Lewis Jazz Orchestra, and I said, "Wow, man, it's something." But I reacted to it not as a arranger, just as a musician. And this is really great. And and then I bought all of the albums when they came out, and Thad's writing just killed me. It's his harmony had a lot of density to it, but it swung so hard. That's the thing about Thad's music. It swung, and there was always a sense of joy in it. It was never. I mean, the music was serious, but everyone was having a good time doing it, including Thad. And then at the same time, I started to get into the music of Bob Brookmeyer because he was with Thad and Mel in those days, and that was my first time of hearing his writing. It was some of the things he had written for Thad and Mel. And then some years later, when I joined Thad and Mel as a pianist, and Thad left the band, Mel asked Bob to come in as musical director, and Bob started writing for Mel's band. This was around 1980. And he wrote some amazing music that to me is still one of my models as to how to really write for a big band. It was beautiful stuff. And again, it swung hard, but in a different way than Thad. So those two guys are still at the top of my list. But then there's a lot of others: Gil Evans, Oliver Nelson, um, people like even Fletcher Henderson, Maria Schneider. There's a lot of people that I still enjoy, and some of their stuff has rubbed off on me over the years. Certainly, but I didn't really start to get into those guys. Fletcher, to me, there's who I call the three wise men, or the three godfathers of the big band, or Fletcher Henderson, Benny Carter, and Don Redman. And Don Redman worked for Fletcher Henderson for a while, as did Benny Carter, and then they went their own ways. But those three guys, they were writing all the time. I mean, in those days, you wrote and you wrote and you wrote, and because the band was working all the time, and you had to do arrangements you were writing for dancing. Your main job was to get people up on their feet dancing. And I didn't really start to, I'd heard a lot of their music over the years, but it wasn't until I started to write for the Carnegie Hall Jazz Band in the early 90s. And there, we were taking older music and I was rearranging it in a more up-to-date way. So I had to really look at the original stuff, and I really got into, especially Fletcher and Don Redman. Don Redman was a genius, I think, and so those guys. It took me a while to really find out about those guys, but they were deep.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a little different, one thing about the band that I work with, it's the Frankfurt Radio Big Band, and there are still a few radio bands left in Europe. 30 years ago, there were a lot, but most of them have died away. The ones that are still operating, they have to have an artistic reason to exist. They can't just be playing dance music and pop singers, because you don't need, you get recordings for that. So the band I work with, every week or every 2 weeks, they have to be a completely different band. That's a big challenge. The Vanguard Orchestra doesn't have to do that. Maybe the Lincoln Center Orchestra has to do that a little bit, because they do a lot of different projects. But the band I work with, 2 weeks ago, I was there and I wrote a program of arrangements of jazz tunes written by tenor players with Branford Marsalis. It was really straight ahead. Most of it was really straight ahead, high energy stuff, and it really swinging, and it was great. I left there after the last concert. The next week, they were working with a pop singer, and then now this week they're doing concerts in schools, so they're doing some pretty basic things. Next week I'm there with Anat Cohen, the clarinetist, so it'll be some straight ahead and some kind of modern things. But every week they have to figure out, who are we this week? So it's a thing they have to do in their head that's different than most of the bands in the U.S. They're led by one person, and you're playing their music. And Maria Schneider plays Maria's music, and she's of course, that's why she went through all the years of putting the band together. And then there's not so much difference anymore. 20 years ago, you might have said, well, maybe the rhythm sections in the U.S. are better, but they're, just like here, there were jazz workshops and jazz schools starting, well, North Texas was the first, but there have been jazz schools in the U.S. since the 60s, especially, and summer workshops. Those started up in Europe in the 80s, and so there's a lot of players now that came up through those and had a lot of exposure to American jazz musicians, and a number of them, came to the U.S. They'd go to Berkeley for a couple of years and they'd go back, and now they're in their 40s and 50s and they're working on the scene. So there's not quite as much difference anymore as there used to be. It depends whether it's an original composition or arrangements. Um, if it's an original composition, I take a lot of time with very small ideas, and I start to develop them. And at the same time, I plan out a very general plan for the piece. Um, it's usually when I write for an original piece for a big band, it's usually for a certain band, the Vanguard Orchestra or some other band that commissions me. So I have an idea of their strengths and weaknesses. You always think about the strengths and weaknesses of the players. And in fact, I think of myself as it's almost like I'm writing a play, and the players are the actors in the play, and you're giving them lines to speak. And so if it's an original piece, I'll take a lot of time just working with small ideas and developing them, and then starting to put them into the big plan and so forth. With arrangements of other people's tunes, I will usually make a lead sheet and just play through the tune a lot and get some ideas and really get to know the tune well before I start to arrange it. I find it very important, I'll come up with a lot of ideas, and one thing that's important is most of the time you can't use all the ideas you have. You have to learn to throw some of them away, and okay, I'm not going to do that in this arrangement. And then I find it very important for both original composition and for doing arrangements. I use a lot of pencil and paper in the beginning. When I came up, that's all we had. And I started using the computer in the early 90s. And I tried writing music directly on the computer. I found it really not only difficult, but it was unsatisfying. It was cold, So now the computer is a very important tool for me, but all of the sketch work and everything I do with pencil and paper. And then I put it into the sketch on the computer, and then I go from the sketch to the score. But I find that getting my hands on the piano and a pencil in my hand, I really feel a connection to the music that way that I don't get when I'm just looking at a computer screen and putting things in.
Great. Thank you.
You're welcome.